For our panelists today, we're very lucky to have Michaela Romesser, who is a senior associate at the firm and has vast experience processing E-2 visas. My name is Kelly Weiner. I'm a partner at Scott Legal, and I will also be speaking towards the end of the presentation. If you have questions, please send them through the chat box, and we will reserve time at the end for questions. This webinar is also being recorded and will be made available. We also have, many different webinars and other informative videos available on our YouTube channel. So we would encourage you to subscribe so you can get that most up-to-date information. So without further delay, I will turn it over to Michaela to walk us through the E-2 visa rules and regulations.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And yeah, let's get started with the E-2 visa requirements. So the E-2 visa is a non-immigrant visa that allows nationals of certain countries to come to the US and develop and direct operations of a business in which they have invested substantial amount of money. So there are basically two options how you can obtain an E-2 visa. So you can either purchase an existing business, and this also includes a franchise. If you are thinking about purchasing a franchise, that would be a great option for an E-2. Or you could also start your own business in the US. So you would set up a company in the US, and then you would purchase, everything that company needs to start operations in the US. So to be able to qualify for an E-2 visa, you must be a national of a treaty country, and that country has to have an E-2 visa, E-2 treaty with United States. So many countries from Europe, Africa, Asia, Latin America, Middle East are E-2 visa treaty countries. What's important to keep in mind here is that, what matters is your country of nationality, so and not the country of birth. So let's say, for example, that you were born in a country that is not an E-2 visa treaty country. So let's say, for example, that you were born in China, that is not an E-2 visa treaty country, but later in your life you got a citizenship of an E-2 visa treaty country. You would be able to apply for the E-2 visa with that E-2 visa treaty country passport. So you would still be able to apply. And then, how long, for how long is your E-2 visa valid? So, this will depend on your country of nationality. So there is a different, what we call reciprocity period for, each country. I will say that many countries, nationals of many countries can get the E-2 visa issued for a period, of up to 5 years. But there are some countries, where, the nationals can only get the E-2 visa for kind of like a short period of time. So, for example, if you are a national of Jordan, you would only be able to get the E-2 visa for 3 months. And so what happens, like if you are a national of like one of the countries where the reciprocity period is, 3 months, or like, let's say 1 year. So here, one thing to keep in mind is that even if you get the E-2 visa issued for only a period of 3 months, when you enter the US with that visa, you will be allowed to stay in the US for a period of 2 years. So when you enter the electronic I-94, like it should reflect the period of 2 years. Now, you will only be able, like if you want to travel internationally, you will only be able to do that like as long as your E-2 visa is valid. So like, let's say that you travel after the E-2 visa expires, you will have to go back to the consulate and get a new E-2 visa. But, like you will be able to stay in the US for that period of 2 years. And, even nationals of treaty countries that get the E-2 visa issued for a period of 5 years, they will also only be admitted to the US for the period of 2 years at a time. So, they will be, like if you are, for example, national of Canada, and you would get the E-2 visa issued for a period of 5 years. Every time you enter, like you would only be allowed to stay for a period of 2 years. Before the 2-year period is up, you would have to, leave the US, and as long as the E-2 visa is valid, you would be allowed to, re-enter, and then you would get additional period of 2 years. Perfect. So now let's discuss the E-2 visa requirements in more detail. So as we already mentioned, you must be a national of a treaty country to qualify for an E-2 visa. The next requirement, I would say probably the most important, is that you must make a substantial investment in the US. And so, what does this mean? So it means that the money, you are investing, the money must be at risk. And this means that, you must have something to lose. And so this basically means that the money has already been invested and spent, before you apply for the E-2 visa. So, the government basically wants to see that, before they kind of issue the E-2 visa, you have spent the money and you have made that substantial investment in the US. Now, let's say that you have money sitting on your bank account, you have $200,000 sitting on your bank account, and you haven't made any expenditures, but you have the money on the account in the US, and you plan to spend the money, once the E-2 visa is approved, will this work for an E-2 visa? And the answer is no, because, if you have money sitting on a bank account, that money, the government doesn't consider that money to be at risk. And basically they want to see that, you have already spent the money. So in that case, if you haven't invested any money and you just have money sitting on the account, you wouldn't be able to get an E-2 visa. So for the money you are investing, you will have to show that there is a clear source of funds. And so what this means is that the money you are investing in the US must come from a legitimate source. And this means that the money doesn't come from, criminal activity. So the money can come basically from any legitimate source. It can come from savings from your employment. It can come from sale of a property you own. It can come from a gift, either from your family member or from basically anyone. Loans. Loan can also be source for E-2 investment. But one thing to keep in mind for loans is that the loan cannot be secured by the assets of the E-2 company. But let's say, for example, that you have a loan and it's secured by a property you own, or is unsecured. Both of those would be completely fine for an E-2 visa. Now, one thing I wanted to mention about gifts and loans. So let's say that, you have a family member who is willing to either gift or loan you money for the E-2, we would still have to submit documents kind of showing and explaining where did the person, what is the source of the money, the person is either gifting or loaning to you. So, let's say that you have a family member and they want to gift you money, and the source of the money is kind of, savings from their employment. In that case, you would have to submit 2 or 3 most recent tax returns of the person who is gifting you the money. And then the E-2 investment must be substantial, and what this means, we'll discuss this more on the next slide. So what are some typical E-2 visa expenditures? So, let's say that you are starting a business in the US. Then some typical expenditures would be, for example, inventory. So let's say that you are starting a business and you will be selling products to customers. So then we could include any inventory you purchased. We could include any equipment. So computer equipment, office equipment, any equipment you need to kind of be able to operate that type of business. We could include any money you paid for kind of website creation, any money you paid for, marketing, any kind of office supplies you purchased, Then we could also include any kind of office rent, if you have an office or warehouse rent, like if you need kind of a space to store kind of products you'll be selling. And then also, like any money you paid for company setup, business entity setup, and also legal fees you paid for business entity setup, and also the immigration legal fees. Now, these would be kind of like the typical expenditures if you are starting a business from scratch in the US. And then in case you are purchasing a business in the US, then the investment would be basically, the purchase price you paid to the seller. That would generally be the only expenditure we would include. Now, like let's say that you are purchasing a business, I don't know, for example, a restaurant, and you are also doing some like major renovations, we could also potentially include those. But generally, for a purchase of business, we would include the purchase price of the business. Now, the next requirement for the E-2 visa is that the E-2 business cannot be marginal. And, we'll again discuss this on one of the next slides, but this basically means that the US company must have capacity, either present or future, to be able to hire US employees. And, our general recommendation is that you should plan to have at least 3 full-time employees by year 5 of operation. So, like if you are starting a new business in the US, you don't have to have the employees before you apply for the E-2 visa, but you should be able to submit a business plan, with hiring projections, and those should show that there will be at least 3 full-time employees by year 5. Now, the next requirement is that the business must be real and operating. So this requirement means that the business must either be already operating, so the business already taking revenue from clients, or is in the final stages, before the business starts operations. So now let's discuss, these 2 scenarios. So, like in case you are purchasing a business in the US, like that business, will generally, will already be operating. And in that case, for these requirements, we'll be submitting evidence such as, payroll, showing that, the business has employees. We would be submitting, the company's tax return, like showing the revenue the company had in the previous years, and then also current profit and loss statement and balance sheet. Now, let's say that you are starting your own business in the US, like you set up an entity in the US, you kind of, like you made the investment, but, like you don't have any employees yet, and the business kind of is not taking revenue yet. In that case, we would prove the real and operating requirement by things like, we would submit signed commercial lease agreement, like showing that, yes, the business is not taking revenue yet, but you have an office space ready, and you will kind of start the operations as soon as you come to the US. We would also point to the fact that, like you have already made that substantial E-2 investment in the business, and describe the expenditures in detail. We would explain that, you already set up the legal entity in the US. And then we would also be submitting evidence, such as evidence that, like the company has a website, has kind of marketing materials in place, evidence that you have created business bank account, evidence that you have obtained tax ID for the entity. And then, if you have any kind of letters of intent with clients, we would be submitting those. And then, in case you are able to kind of obtain contracts with clients, that would also be a kind of great evidence for the real and operating. The next requirement is that, you are coming to the US to solely develop and direct the E-2 enterprise. So what this means is that, you are coming to the US to basically run the operations of the E-2 company. And for the E2, what we would want to show is that you are coming to the US to kind of perform high-level managerial and executive duties, and you will be basically responsible for kind of daily management of the company, management of the employees, business development, kind of management of company's financials. So, we would kind of want to point to those duties. Also, sometimes when you are submitting application and, in the hiring projections, like you don't kind of, you don't show that you will show that you are only kind of planning to start hiring employees in like year 3 or 4, then kind of this, the development direct requirement could become an issue because especially USCIS, they could point to the fact that, like you will be basically the only person kind of like working for the E2 entity, kind of like doing all the work. So they could push back on the fact and kind of argue that you will not develop and direct the enterprise. So kind of the key to keep in mind is that, you will want to show that you will kind of perform these high-level managerial and executive duties. And also, for the development direct and also kind of the next requirement, you will have to show that you own at least 50% in the E2 company. And this is kind of extremely important, at the time you are applying for an E2 visa, but also kind of after the E2 visa is granted. You should keep in mind that you always have to keep at least 50% in the E2 company. It's fine, like let's say, for example, that you start with 100% and like later you sell, I don't know, 25 or 50% to someone else, but you always have to keep at least 50%. And, if the ownership kind of drops, that could mean that, like you're no longer, kind of qualified for the E2. And then the last requirement is that you must have intent to return to your home country when your E2 visa expires. And, for this, the only document we usually really submit is kind of your signed declaration declaring that, like once your E2 visa expires, you plan to return to your home country. And the government, generally doesn't want to see, anything else. So, like the standard here is kind of like much, like lower and different than, like let's say, for example, you are applying for a B visa, tourist visa, like you have to submit evidence of kind of like all these ties you have to your home country. For E2, that is not the requirement. And even the regulations say that, like for E2, it's allowed to kind of like move all your belongings, to the US, kind of sell property in your home country. So you will not have to submit kind of evidence of, extensive ties to your home country for E2. Perfect. So now let's move on and let's discuss, the substantiality, investment requirement, or like how much investment is enough for the E2. So the regulations state that you must invest substantial amount of money in order to qualify for the E2. But there is no kind of minimum set amount, dollar amount in the regulations. So the amount you will have to invest will depend on few things. So it's gonna depend on the type of business you are starting. So like let's say that you are starting kind of service-based, service-oriented business, such as, for example, consulting company. The investment required will be much lower than, for example, if you're starting, like a manufacturing, kind of business. Then, it's going to also depend on kind of like the location where you are applying and the examiner. So these, different consulates are used to kind of seeing different, like investment amounts. So there are certain consulates, like where the consular officers are used to kind of seeing these large, like multinational companies, kind of applying for the E2, for E2 registration. So, like they're used to kind of seeing that, the E2 investment is like, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So if you kind of go to that consulate and you only invest like $70,000, $80,000, like because the officers are used to kind of like seeing those large investment amounts, your application could be denied at that consulate. And on the other hand, like there are consulates that are kind of like used to seeing, like much lower investment amounts, and at those consulate, like investment of $70,000, $80,000 would be completely fine. And then, the investment amount is also going to kind of depend on the overall strength of the application. So, here, like let's say that your investment amount is on the lower side, so like let's say that you invested, for example, $50,000, $60,000, and then you have additional like $40,000, $50,000 as working capital. But the business, you already hired an employee in the US, and the business already started taking revenue, has been taking revenue, for a couple months, and then you also have, you can present evidence that you have signed contracts with clients. That case, still has kind of really high chance for, to be approved, because like even though the investment amount was on the lower side, the other kind of aspects and of the applications are very strong. So, I would say that if you have investment amount that is kind of on the lower side, you would want to focus and kind of like make the other aspects of the application very, very strong. So the test the government, for startup companies, the test that the government uses to kind of determine whether, the E2 investment is substantial is called proportionality test. And they basically look at, like how much money you invested in the E2 company versus, like what are the usual costs to establish this type of company. And then they basically kind of like look at those two and compare them. And if you kind of invested, close to 100%, then, they would conclude that, the investment is substantial. Now, let's say that you are purchasing a business in the US, then the test would be basically, like they would look at, the purchase price and then the fair market value of the business. And if those, would be same or kind of similar, then they would make, the conclusion that the investment is substantial. So, as we already discussed, franchises are definitely a good option for an E2 visa. And then, let's now discuss just briefly some common good versus bad E2 visa expenditures. So, the good ones we kind of discussed already on the first slide. So, the good ones would be those. The bad ones, they would generally be expenditures such as, flight tickets. So, like people often ask us, like, oh, I came to the US on a B visa to kind of set up the company's account and kind of like to make the investment. Can I include like the money I pay for the flight ticket and then to kind of like rent a car and kind of like rent an Airbnb in the US, like, can we include that as part of the E2 investment? So, the answer to that would be, would be no, because, those expenditures would be, those would be considered kind of weak E2 expenditures, just because, the consular officers don't usually view these as kind of really kind of like necessary or kind of to start the business or kind of like related to, the E2 startup expenditures. Another kind of like weaker expenditure would be, a car. So again, like many people ask, like, can I purchase kind of a vehicle in the US? And, the answer to that question would depend on kind of like what type of business you are starting. So now, like let's say that you are starting like a food delivery or kind of like a car transportation, kind of like Uber or, like some, like similar type of business like that. Like if the car is kind of like absolutely necessary to kind of like, for you to kind of like operate the business, then the car could be included. But let's say that you are starting, I don't know, like a law firm or, like a consulting company, and you just kind of like need the car to, to be able to get to and from work to every day. In that case, the car, we wouldn't include it just because it's a very, it's a very weak expenditure, and the consulate would definitely kind of push back on that expenditure. Perfect. So now let's discuss the marginality requirement and whether and when do you have to hire employees. So as we discussed, you do have to have a plan to hire employees. You do have to have employees, but you do not have to have them at the time you are applying for the E-2. So the plan should be that you plan to hire at least 3 or 4 full-time employees by year 5 of operations, and we generally recommend that these should be kind of W-2 employees. 1099 contractors, those, those could be fine as well. It just kind of depends on, again, kind of like on the type of business you are operating. So like, let's say, for example, that, you operate kind of like a construction or kind of like renovation company, and most of the workers you have are 1099 contractors, like that could be fine, especially if kind of like payments to these contractors are kind of on the, on the higher side. But even in this case, we would generally recommend that you at least have at least like an office assistant or someone as a W-2 employees, or if it's possible to put at least some of those, contractors as W employees, that could be helpful for, especially for the renewal application. And now, how do you prove that you have or you will have employees? So if you are starting your own business as a startup, you would be submitting a business plan with the E-2 visa application, and this is generally kind of required document at most consulates when you are starting a new business in the US. And in that business plan, you would be submitting 5-year hiring projections that would outline your plans, like what employees you plan to hire in which year. And you should also include details such as, like what will be the salaries of the employees, what will be their job duties, whether they will be full-time or part-time, and details like that. In case you are, you are purchasing an already kind of operating business, or in case your startup, is already kind of operating in the US, you could submit evidence such as, payroll, pay stubs of the employees, and then W-2s from previous years, and then tax returns of the company, like showing, like how much the company paid in salaries in last years. Perfect. And I will turn it over to Kelly.
Thank you, Michaela. All right, so let's talk about some business plan considerations for E-2 visa applications. So initial question, do you need a business plan? If you're doing a startup, if it's a brand new business, then yes, you will always need a business plan. A business plan is really key with any startup to prove that the company has the ability to, hire workers, like it's going to set the stage for how the company is going to make money, what the marketing plan is going to be, all of that. If you're purchasing an existing business and it's very successful, let's say it has, dozens of employees and it's very high, high investment amount and, record of success over many years, consistent or growing revenues and profits, maybe not. At that point, you may not need a business plan because the business plan really functions to show that a startup is going to, be able to operate. It's going to have, what products and services it's going to offer, who it's going to hire. So if the business is already operating, you already have proof. There's, pre-existing clients. There's employees that are, coming with the company or that you're going to transfer if it's an asset sale. Then a business plan may not be needed. If you're purchasing an existing business and the business has not been doing very well, or perhaps it never hired employees or only hired, maybe one employee. Are there any kind of issues like that where you're kind of needing to rehabilitate some aspects of the business to get it to be a successful operation? Then a business plan can be a good idea, even if it's a pre-existing business. In terms of what the business plan should contain, for the E-2, there's, certain things you want to focus on. So one is the executive summary, like who are you? What does the company do? Who are your clients? Who are you selling to? Officers are often skimming the application. And so they may, if they only read certain parts, they're definitely going to read the executive summary. So you do want them to get a really good idea of, a very concise and clear description. What does this company do? How is it going to earn money? Another important section is kind of market analysis. So showing like there's actually a market for the services that I'm offering. There are other people doing this line of business. Here's who I'm going to be targeting. Here's who I'm going to be selling to. I think that's also really important, again, to just frame, the narrative for the officer as to what you'll be doing. A marketing plan is also very important. How will you market your products? Will you have a website? Will you do direct sales? What are your strategies for getting people to be aware of your business? There should be some very kind of concrete, realistic steps that you have taken or that you've outlined that you will take that show how your company is going to, get clients and earn money. Every business essentially at this point does need a website. Officers will often, look up the business. If it's a situation where you've developed a website and it's not ready yet, or you don't want it to go live until you get the E-2 visa, that can certainly be explained, but that's generally going to be part of the marketing plan. A personnel plan is another very, very important part of an E-2 business plan. So you want to show 5 years of hiring projections, as Michaela mentioned, very important to show that you're going to hire, between 3 to 4 employees by year 5 of operations or more if the business demands it. You want to include what are the job descriptions, what's the salary, when is each employee going to be hired. You want to account for raises over the years. You want to make sure that the salaries make sense, right? If you say you're hiring, a CFO and paying them $45,000 a year with no raises each year, it's not going to look realistic. It does need to be realistic based on what the actual business plan will be. Also important to include comprehensive, financial plans. So 5 years of financial projections, including, profit and loss statement, cash flow statement, balance sheet. It should be clear in the business plan to a layperson, so somebody who's not familiar with your industry, it should be clear to them how they can how the business will make money, right? So if you're a consulting company and you're going to charge different clients by the hour, there should be calculations that show, hey, it's realistic to earn this amount of revenue. If you're going to sell products, you need to account for kind of the direct costs of selling those products. So all of that, like, again, it needs to make sense to the officer. You need to be able to provide kind of a common sense explanation of how your business will make this money. Sometimes we have people who maybe, we offer the service of business plan drafting, or maybe they hire another company to draft the business plan. Even if an outside vendor is drafting the business plan, the E-2 applicant still needs to understand the numbers in the business plan. So it is important that, the applicant themselves will be able to explain to the officer, generally, here's how, here's why these revenue projections are realistic. Here's why these expense accounts are realistic. Again, if you're including operating expenses and they're never changing over 5 years, it doesn't look realistic. Expenses do not stay flat generally. So those are all things to consider with a business plan. Do you need to hire a professional? So it really depends. There may be, some people who have drafted many business plans, or maybe they have a pitch deck that they're going to start their business plan off of. So a professional is not always needed if the applicant themselves has enough business experience to draft it. That being said, a professional can be very helpful because an E-2 focused business plan it's very different than an investor pitch deck. It can be different than other types of business plans. So you do want to work with somebody who at least can guide you as to what should be included in the business plan. And it can often be helpful, I think, to have a professional draft it. Additionally, there are some consulates that have now started to require that any financials in a business plan are certified by a CPA. So that is something to keep in mind as well. All right, let's talk about some E-2 visa adjudication trends. So, one thing we've seen is sometimes officers will ask about, how much of the money was actually invested in the US. So it's not a requirement in the law or regulations that the substantial investment be made in the US. For example, if your business is going to kind of import, rugs from abroad, if you pay, for inventory to this vendor that's outside the US, that's a completely legitimate E-2 expense. That being said, we have noticed that there are some officers that will ask about this. And so it is a good idea, if it's possible, to spend a certain amount of money in the United States. So if you have the option to kind of use a vendor outside the US or a vendor in the US for an expense, it's much better to use a US, the US vendor for the investments. Also important to talk about administrative processing. So, if you're going to a consulate for your E-2 application, when you submit and you go attend your interview, often they will tell you right then and there if you're approved or if you're denied. Another thing that can happen is you can be put into administrative processing. And this can mean a few different things. So you'll receive a form called a 221G. It is a technical denial. So unfortunately, if you have ESTA, it does mean that you would need to reapply for ESTA and likely be, denied because of this technical denial. So that is something to keep in mind. Sometimes cases are put into administrative processing because the officer wants some more information. For example, if there was something they wanted to see, corporate document that wasn't available at the interview, they may, write that down and say, please, provide this to us, and then we'll continue processing the case. Maybe there's a criminal record they want to look at. Another reason why you can be put into administrative processing is that your application has been flagged by another US agency. And this could be kind of a security concern, could be based on name. So those situations, it can be much harder to resolve them quickly. Because at that point, the consulate does not have any ability to move the case forward. They are waiting for the other agency that flagged the application to clear the application. So at that point, really all you can do is continue to follow up every 30 days. So in some circumstances where there's administrative processing, they may ask for more information about the person's background, travel history. Sometimes allows for 15 years of employment and travel history. Often in those cases, there is some security flag that's been put up. So if you are put into administrative processing, definitely important to speak with your attorney, review the form. If they have requested any documentation, provide that as soon as you can. If not, unfortunately, it will be a situation where you're just waiting and continuing to follow up periodically. Something that became more popular, during the pandemic was increased USCIS filings. So, for the E-2, there's two options. One is that you can go to the consulate and get an E-2 visa stamp. This is often a, kind of a better option, for many people, because, for example, Canadian nationals can get a 5-year E-2 visa stamp in their passport. This allows them to travel internationally, allows them to come run the company. If you do a USCIS filing, you're doing a change or extension of status, and the maximum time you can be granted is 2 years. Additionally, once you leave the United States, you would not be able to re-enter using that approval notice. You would actually have to go to a consulate, submit a new E-2 application. They will review it as though it is a new E-2 application, so they're not required in any way to defer to or rely on the USCIS approval. So, very often, if given the option, the consulate may be a better option. However, especially as people were, unable to travel, during COVID, USCIS filings became more popular. So it is an option. It is something, for example, if you really don't care at all about, needing not to travel internationally, it can be a better option for you. USCIS is also more amenable to low investment amounts, very low investment amounts, sometimes even as low as 20,000, 30,000 for businesses where it makes sense. So you still couldn't, submit a manufacturing company and spend $15,000. But if it's a service-based business, we have seen some approvals with very, very low investment amounts. They are much riskier cases, much harder cases, but USCIS kind of will entertain them much more than consulates will. Timing at the consulate. So this has been, ever since COVID, the consulates have all been reopening on an ad hoc basis. Many of them have now been back at normal processing for some time. So places like Toronto, London, generally are processing processing similar numbers of E-2s as they did pre-pandemic. Japan. Unfortunately, there are still some that are very, very backlogged. The consulate in Colombia comes to mind. There's also many consulates now that are, like will only process kind of citizens of that country. Again, a lot of that is related to backlogs that happened during COVID and the consulate having the discretion to allocate kind of their workforce and their workload in the way that works best for them. In terms of timing, always important to kind of check with your attorney around the time you're filing because timing is a moving target. For example, right now in Toronto, they're generally taking about 10 to 15 business days to review cases. And then once they've reviewed, they'll open the calendar for you. People can generally schedule within maybe 2 to 6 weeks. But this does vary. This does change. And there are kind of times when things get really busy. For example, the summer and the holiday season are two very busy seasons at consulates, and also seasons where there's perhaps lower staff. People are away for the holidays. Also, there are, they take the holidays of both the country the consulate is located in. So timing is really a moving target and something you're always going to need to check kind of around the time that you're actually submitting your application. All right, let's talk about some complex areas that come up for E2s. So source and trail of funds. If you are investing your money into an E2, sometimes people will think, oh, I'll just get a gift, and then I can just submit a gift letter. But that's not the case. You always have to show the money came from a legitimate source. So a gift letter, if you're receiving a gift, will be one piece of documentation, but then you'll need to include other documentation to prove that the gift came from a legitimate source. So for example, if your parent is gifting you money from their personal savings, your parent needs to be comfortable providing their tax returns. If you are, doing a filing with USCIS, they take a very, very strict approach to the source and trail of funds. That means they want to see exactly where the money originated and then see where it was maintained until it's actually spent, by the E2 company. So, for a consulate, you can take a more holistic approach. For example, you could say it's from my personal savings from employment. You could include your tax returns and maybe proof of you transferring a lump sum to the E2 company. For USCIS, they're actually going to want to see that money that you earned entering your bank account and then either being maintained there, or if it was transferred somewhere else, like let's say it was all transferred to a savings account, you'll have to show that trail to where it was transferred to, where it was maintained, and then where it was actually spent. So it is a much, much more, comprehensive view of the source and trail of funds if you're doing a USCIS filing. Also important to note that loans secured by company assets cannot be used for, an E2 investment. So for example, this comes up a lot in the context of seller financing. When you're purchasing a business and there's some aspect of seller financing to it, generally the seller financing is, the seller is willing to kind of finance the purchase because it's secured by the assets of the company. So that does not work for an E2. So let's say that the company was $200,000 and the investor wants to invest $100,000 and then seller financing is $100,000. So only $100,000 of that will count towards E2 investment because anything that's guaranteed, secured by the assets of the company is not considered at risk. So definitely important that if you are going to use a loan, it needs to either be secured by personal property, not secured by assets of the E2 company, or it can also be an unsecured loan. Sometimes people, maybe they own a residence, they own a home, they take out a home equity, line of credit. That's completely fine for the E2 source of funds. Other things that come up, small investment amounts. And we actually have a different webinar that really goes over in much more detail, what you can do, with small investment amounts, ways that you can strengthen the case. As Michaela mentioned, there are some consulates that are used to seeing huge companies, multinational companies that have investments of millions of dollars and are just sending lots of employees. At those consulates, small investment amounts may be much more difficult. Whereas, as I mentioned with USCIS, they may even entertain investments as low as 20 or 30,000, assuming the business, it makes sense in light of the type of business you're starting. So if you do have a small investment amount, it's always very important that every other aspect of the case is very strong. So it's not required that you hire an employee before you file, but if the investment amount is very small and you're able to hire an employee, that can be very, very helpful. Also really important to have a strong business plan, really important to show the business is going to make money right away, especially if there's not a lot of working capital available. So you need to make the strongest business case you can for why this will be successful. And that's always the case, but with a small investment amount, it's even more important. Um, Other things, people will ask, can I get two E2 visas? Can I, can my friend and I, can we be business partners and invest? So yes, this is possible as long as you each own 50% of the company. If you do not each own 50% of the company, then the structure does not work. If the business partners are the same nationality, like let's say there's a two Canadians and they want to own it 70-30, you could consider one investor application and one E2 employee application. But that's only possible if the investor and employee have the same nationality. Another thing to consider with two investors is that the investment amounts should be generally equal. They don't need to be exactly equal, but you shouldn't have a situation where one person's investing $100,000 and another person's investing $10,000. In that case, the person investing $10,000 is really going to struggle to show they have actually put a substantial amount at risk, especially when their partner invested so much more. It's also not a good idea when there's business partners for any business partner to gift or loan money to the other one. That can really run into issues because ultimately the consulate may decide, well, your business partner gave this to you, but they also own the company. So really it was just them investing in the company. It's not really going through you. Other things to consider, substantive changes to the business after filing. There are some people that kind of will get the visa or the E2 USCIS approval, and they suddenly think, okay, great, I can do anything. I can start another company. I got the E2 visa for a French restaurant, but now I want to be a wedding photographer. So substantive changes, need to be approved beforehand. So if you're in a situation where you're, in the U.S. running your French restaurant and you want to close it down and start a different type of company, you need to go back to the consulate or to USCIS first. You cannot, just start the new activity if it's substantially different from what you discussed with the consulate. If it's a situation where there's kind of a natural outgrowth of what you were already doing, let's say you're running a French restaurant and you want to open a second location, that's generally fine. It's within the purview of what you've, disclosed to the consulate. But if it's completely different, it's much better to, discuss with your attorney first to see, what do you need to submit, if anything. You also should never dissolve the corporate entity that you used to get the E2 visa. It is an entity-specific visa. So if you've kind of completely dissolved that E2 company and just started a brand new company, it's generally going to be a violation of status. Also, family business purchases, this does come up quite a bit. If you are doing a family business purchase, you do want to kind of take extra steps to show that the purchase price is substantial. So, either getting an outside valuation, having a CPA, comment on the financials. So it makes sense, what the purchase price is. If you're buying 50% of a business for $50,000, but, the assets and the cash flow and the revenue, show that this is an extremely profitable business worth significantly more than that, the officer may think that, your family has just cut you a deal. This isn't really a substantial investment. So always important to take that into account if you're purchasing from, a party that you are related to. All right, let's talk about some common reasons for E2 denials. So one is low investment amount. There are some investments that are just too low. A client comes to mind who, invested $2,000 and put $98,000 in a business bank account. You just need to spend more than that. $2,000 is not going to be considered a substantial amount being put at risk in the commercial sense. I'd say goods part about being denied for low investment amount is that if you do have additional funds to invest, it's very clear how to kind of, like resubmit the application as you can invest more money. The nature of the business can also be a reason for denial. So there's certain, industries that just have more scrutiny on them. For example, real estate. Consults are always very concerned. Is somebody just purchasing a property and are they just going to collect rental income? Is it going to be passive and not actually be an active, real and operating company? Similarly, consulting businesses, there's a lot of concern that they're just going to come in and operate as a solo consultant and not hire workers and not expand the business. So those can be issues. Filing location and venue are very important. So there are definitely trends at different consulates. There's different consulates that are more and less open to, smaller investment amounts, smaller businesses. So always important to discuss your options with an attorney. Um, Concern over, marginality issues. So will the business create jobs for U.S. workers? This can be a particular issue if you've run a company in in your home country for many years and you never hired anyone. They may find it harder to believe the business plan if they see, historical record of you ran a similar company for 10 years with no employees. In those types of cases, it can be much better and favorable to hire an employee before you actually file to try to head off that concern. Sometimes you have issues with the adjudicating officer. Consular officers are human beings. They're processing hundreds of applications, sometimes even, daily. And there are sometimes where officers, are either not having a good day or they are new, they don't understand the law. If you are in a situation where you had an officer where you felt they were really off base, um, you know, generally, if you reapply, they do try to give you a different officer. There's also certain things you can do to try to escalate, although it's quite limited. Most of the time, the best thing to do at that point is reapply. Other reasons, maybe you didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. There are some, sometimes people submit on their own or maybe, submit with not a good understanding. Maybe they submit with, they only own 30% and the US citizens own 70%. That's just not going to qualify, for the E-2. So it is important to work with an attorney who really is familiar with this, the requirements, when you're preparing these applications. All right. Final slide before we get to the questions. What does it take to renew an E-2 visa? So hiring workers is key. We recommend at least 3 full-time equivalents in 5 years. Salary doesn't matter. However, it should meet, all the and any employment or legal requirements. It should be at least the minimum wage, things like that. And it should, again, it needs to make sense in light of the type of, if you're paying the minimum wage to somebody who's kind of a cashier at a gas station, it's likely fine. If you've hired a CFO and you're paying the minimum wage, it's going to could raise some eyebrows. And, if you are in an industry where, it's very common to hire 1099s, like people in the construction industry. If you're hiring subcontractors and spending hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars paying them, and you have a very small staff or you don't really have, W-2 employees, that may be okay. There is always those outlier situations, but generally it's going to be much stronger for your case if you've hired, W-2 employees. You also have to provide updated financial data. So we've listed here kind of tax returns for 2 years. There are some consulates that want to see more, that want to see all tax returns since the last filing. This really is consulate specific. Some consulates have a very streamlined process for renewals and ask for very little documentation. Some want everything. Some don't have any process for renewals. They just say submit everything again. Always good to highlight it if the company met or exceeded its revenue targets, if it's profitable. You always want to provide kind of the payroll information for W-2s and show, if you've paid 1099s. If you're able to point to any particularly effective, strategies from your marketing and sales plan. For example, if you opened a restaurant and now you've got tons of great, online reviews, those can be, things that are helpful to mention. If the company is not doing well, you may want to submit kind of a supplementary, smaller version of a business plan, just showing how you plan to get the company back on track. You'd also need to flag, explain that the company still meets the E-2 requirements. So, if you own the company, 80% and you sold 40% of it, and now you, the investor, only own 40%, that could be a major issue. So ownership changes should always be discussed with your attorney before you make those changes. Similarly, changes to the type of business I discussed in the last slide, which is that you need to be, working in the area that you, explained to the consulate or to USCIS. Or it needs to be kind of arguably a natural outgrowth, not a substantial change to your plan. But if it is a substantial change, you really need to get that approval before you make those changes. You cannot just kind of close down one business, open another, without kind of first going back and getting an approval on that. All right. So we have reached the question and answer portion. So we'll start working through these. So Michaela, can you take the first one? Do you have to have employees at the time you start the business and by the time you submit your case?
Yeah, so this is not required, so you don't have to have, employees. like at the time you are submitting the E2 visa application. But if you don't have employees, like if you're starting a business, then you would want to submit, a strong business plan with the application that would describe the hiring projections of the company.
Perfect. I can take this next one. It's asking if you're in the US in F1 status, doing, and doing a change of status, can you work for your business before you submit your case? So the F1, like in many instances, the answer is no. The F1 is a student visa. If you are on OPT and your business is in the line of work that's permitted on OPT, then you're permitted to work for your business, but that permission is based solely on OPT, on having your optional practical training and your EAD, and that has to be something that's reported to your, designated school official. If you're just on F1 status, you're still attending school, generally no. Similarly, if you're in your grace period, your EAD has expired and you're in your grace period, then no. In those circumstances, yes, it would be better to employ someone to do that work, so you're not going to face issues with USCIS. Michaela, can you take this next one on the topic of hiring employees?
Yeah, so the question is, do consulates accept hiring remote US citizens? So people still located in the US, but not at the location of the business, or would this introduce risk for the application? Yeah, so this is fine. Like if it makes sense for a business. So like let's say that you have, I don't know, like a service-based oriented business, and all the employees or many of them are remote. Like that's completely fine. If you like run a restaurant or you have like a physical store, then obviously the employees would need to work there. So, but if it makes sense for the type of business, it's completely fine.
Perfect. I can take these next couple ones. How much profit has to be made for the time of renewal? There is no kind of dollar figure. Obviously more is better. I think as long as you are able to hire and pay employees, they're less concerned about how much profit you made, but it is something they can ask about, particularly, if they're concerned, how is the investor kind of supporting themselves? Um, can one start a business outside their expertise? For example, an engineer without business or management experience wishing to start a restaurant. Yes, you can. You absolutely can. What we usually do is we look at the resume, we'll pull out anything that is useful, or helpful, to kind of support that the person will be able to develop and direct the business. To give you an example, we had someone who's an agricultural manager for 30 years, really had a passion to become a wedding photographer, had taken some photography classes. That E2 visa was approved. So there should be kind of an explanation about why you're transitioning into the industry, but it's not required that you start up a business, in the field you've been working in. I'll take this one as well. Does the English level of the E2 applicant affect the application? It can. With USCIS, it won't, because you won't go to an interview. If you are going to a consulate, then you do have to do an interview. And an officer could ask, how will you run the business if you do not, speak English well, or if you're still learning English. So we have gotten those cases approved, but they are trickier cases and do require more strategy. Michaela, can you take this next one?
Perfect. So I'm a Canadian citizen. How would you answer to the visa officer that I will be leaving the country after my E2 visa expires? Yes, I would say like this really like, as we discussed, like for the E2 and kind of like this requirement, like the only document you have to submit is kind of like the signed declaration that, like after the E2 visa expires, you plan to leave, but like even that, like that doesn't prevent you to like renew the E2 visa in the future. So like from our experience, like this doesn't really come up at the interviews, or like it's not an issue. Like you would just want to kind of like make it clear that like after your visa expires, you have intent to come back, but like you would, even in that case, like you will be allowed to renew the visa in the future.
Perfect.
Um,
Michaela, can you take this next one? I think.
Yeah, so I'm a Canadian citizen. If my share of 25% in a running business, so I think someone owns or is planning to own 25% in a company, and the investment will be up to 200,000. Will I qualify for E2? So no. So like you would have to you would have to own at least 50% in the company. So you would want to purchase at least 50%.
Perfect. I can look at this one. I'm a Canadian citizen. My partner is a Canadian permanent resident. If we're willing to spend 50% each, an investment is 300 to 400,000 will we qualify. So the Canadian citizen could potentially qualify. Unfortunately, the Canadian permanent resident, we would need to know what their nationality is and if it's an E2 treaty country nationality. So the Canadian permanent residency doesn't permit you to qualify as kind of a Canadian. It depends on the passport that the person has. Um, what are the complications if you apply for an E-2 visa while in the US? I'm planning to buy a restaurant franchise. I'm a Canadian citizen. I think there's not necessarily complications, but kind of just some issues to consider. So one is, what status are you on in the US? So if you're if you're on B1 business visitor status and you're doing kind of setup activities, to purchase the restaurant franchise, that's likely fine. If you're there as a tourist or you're not there on a work visa, it can be a little bit, trickier. They may ask, what were you doing in the United States? Generally for Canadian citizens, as we mentioned during the presentation, the consulate can be a much better option just because you will get a 5-year visa stamp as opposed to a 2-year approval. And also USCIS will want a lot more documentation regarding the source of funds than the consulate would in Toronto. Michaela, can you take this next one?
Yeah. How does an E2 work in case of a startup with 2 co-founders owning 50%? Can the company raise venture capital investment? Yeah. So thing to keep in mind here again is that, like each of you, if both of you are applying for the E2, like each of you always has to keep at least 50% in the E2 company. So like you wouldn't be able to kind of give the ownership away. So, each of you always has to own at least, 50%.
Yeah, I think the venture capital question does come up. It is kind of a more complex answer, where like ultimately, as Michaela said, you each have to own 50%. Sometimes there's things you can do where perhaps you're selling shares, with different levels or different classes, but it is more complicated. And if you are in a situation where you really are going to lose, that 50% ownership, that can be very problematic. So maybe you need to have a plan in place for transitioning to another type of visa if you do end up raising, VC funding. So that I'd say that's a more complex question, one that's, probably best suited to a consult to kind of talk through the various, specifics. All right, I'm a Canadian citizen. The business plan is to buy a property for a short-term rental, such as Airbnb. I'll manage the property, check in, check out. Will this qualify? So owning one property and managing it, I think is not a good option for an E2. I think if we have had people that maybe are maybe they own one of their own Airbnbs and then they also do property management for other people, other people who own other Airbnbs. So the important thing with that is what is the scope of the business, and kind of just managing 1 or 2 properties, I think is generally not going to work, unless they're kind of like huge apartment buildings. It really does need to be, a matter of scale, I think, when it comes to property management. And it's much better if you have outside clients that aren't just, just properties you own. Again, because this concern goes back to, are you just collecting passive rental income and kind of managing your own investment properties as opposed to actually running a business? All right. How long does it take for a spouse's EAD to arrive? So EADs for E2 spouses are no longer needed as of a couple years ago, based just on the visa. As long as the spouse enters and gets an I-94 that's annotated as E2S for E2 spouse, they can work based on that. They do not have to apply for an employment authorization document. They're allowed to, but they don't need to. Someone's asked if we open more subsidiaries within the E2 business entity, does it qualify to apply for the green card? I'm not quite sure what this is asking. Opening subsidiaries doesn't give you any, there may be things you can apply for, but opening subsidiaries by themselves will not change that. Also, again, the E2 is entity specific, so you cannot just open once you have your E2, you cannot just open new companies and work for them, directly. You would have to, kind of either work for them through business to business relationships or have other people running them. But again, another question that I think is good for a consult. Someone's asked about, an uncle who's a family friend who's going to own 60%. You're going to own 60%. He's going to own 40%. How to justify to the officer that we don't have any relation. Well, you do have a relation, so you would you would explain the situation, and you would just want to make sure that it's clear in the valuation that you've each paid a fair amount. So we have gone a bit over time, but thank you to everyone for your great questions. Thank you to Michaela for sharing your knowledge. I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you.
Okay.